All right, hello everybody. Something went across my, YouTube recommendation list the other day, and I thought it looked like it might be interesting. It is a video by the channel called The Second Story, and the video is titled "This is Why We Never Got Another Lord of the Rings." And the narrator, the second story, she offers a rather. There are parts of it that are right. Let's be fair, right? Like it's not that she's wrong. It's that her short history of fantasy publishing is very over abbreviated, and some exceptions to things that happened are just not really present in her model, if that makes sense. So she kind of starts from the success of the Lord of the Rings. And this already is kind of shaky ground. I mean, pulp fantasy as a thing had been around for a long time at that point. And, epic fantasy, I mean, I don't know. I feel like Tolkien wasn't the first one to at least try. Maybe he was one of the most successful versions of it, but one of the most successful early versions of it. But I feel like definitely epic fantasy existed in some body before Tolkien. She then moves on to, on the wings of, on the wings of that success of Lord of the Rings, a man named Lester Del Rey got his hands on a publishing mark, and that publishing mark focuses on fantasy. Now, soon after, he got his hands on a book by, I believe, Terry Brooks. The book is called Sword of Shannara. We've talked about it over on the Wordy Pair podcast before, but it's kind of, and I don't want to trash it, but it's kind of a copycat to Lord of the Rings that's more, that's shorter and a little bit more digestible, I guess. And from the success of Sword of Shannara, um, Del Rey basically came up with or created a formula for like what he wanted to publish as a fantasy publisher. And the point that she makes is that he did have a significant influence on what fantasy got professionally published for a pretty decent amount of time. That's a valid point. There's definitely some truth to that. Even for instance, she notes that even the Wheel of Time was kind of within this model that Del Rey was aiming for, and he kind of shooed away all the other fantasy authors who were doing something other than what he wanted. There are exceptions to this rule, of course, and we'll get into that in a minute. Now, just to kind of criticize the way she's going so far, she kind of has this anti-corporate greed thing, but there's no reason why there was like a special time that greed suddenly hit this particular part of the publishing industry. You know, with a little bit of entrepreneurial understanding, we understand that a creator of things that are designed to be consumed by the public will generally try to create more of what sells and look for additional opportunities on the side. Was there anything there that was preventing other organizations from springing up and meeting other needs? Well, no. So, this is kind of things working as intended. And it's something that we have today that we didn't have back then, where we have indie and self-publishing capabilities that are so far ahead, moon and stars beyond what could be done in the 1960s and 1970s, and they're great fields for putting out stories that don't fit typical molds. Now, the next part of her history, she kind of talks about how there was all these novels that came out that all had, a male protagonist who was basically good, who went on a quest and eventually defeated the evil, and there was this kind of thing. Eventually, this formula kind of went stale, or at least that's her position on how it went. And she puts this somewhere around in the 1990s. This is, of course, again, I think a little bit of an oversimplification, but it's not a huge one. There were a ton of sword and sorcery, kind of epic fantasy copycats, and not even necessarily copycats, but just kind of in this mold books that appeared, and she shows titles of several of them in her video. By the way, I'll put a link to the video in the description so you can go check it out yourself. It's a little long, but it's not much longer than most of the stuff I do. She then talks about Michael Moorcock, and Michael Moorcock creating this counter-epic fantasy movement that one of the linchpins of it is George R. R. Martin, where she kind of sidesteps here, because the fact is that Moorcock was very active before the 1990s, right? This was not his first rodeo. He was already an established force in fantasy writing and publishing by the 1990s. It's just that he managed to kind of put himself into a situation where he was able to promote writers that he thought were interesting. And I think that her simplifying this into fad, anti-fad is probably a little bit reductive. But the point that she makes, that a lot of the popular fantasy kind of did go in the very opposite direction to Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, does ring true to a certain degree. There were a lot of stories that were now, instead of being, inspiring, they were very dark. Instead of being rather chaste, they became very lewd. Instead of having a flawed but ultimately good hero, we saw a flourishing of anti-heroes and crafty villains. Instead of having a situation where the person who does the right thing gets rewarded in the end, we ended up with situations where the person who does the bad thing is often rewarded in the end. And she's right that this kind of counter formula can get stale too. The point that she makes, the point that she really kind of hammers home at the end, is that fantasy changed course, but it stayed very formulaic. It changed formulas, but it was still subject to a fairly restrictive formula. And she makes some fairly good points to that effect. What are her conclusions in the video? Well, her number one conclusion, which feels to me kind of like a personal prejudice of hers, is to avoid formulas. But the fact is that formulas and exercises have value. You got to learn to walk before you can run. You got to learn to take a derivative before you can do functional analysis. Just calling something a formula is really too broad of a designation, right? Was Shakespeare following a formula by using a multi-act structure for his plays, or iambic pentameter, right? Lord of the Rings was the culmination of years and years and years of work, and I don't want to at all belittle that accomplishment, the accomplishment that was Lord of the Rings. But we also have to look at The Hobbit and say, well, clearly, Tolkien has improved from, the 1930s when he wrote The Hobbit, I think, to the late 40s, early 50s when he wrote and eventually published Lord of the Rings. Another point that she makes is about corporate greed, which I think is, again, a little bit of a misfire. It's very easy and cheap to criticize corporations, but for some reason we don't also criticize the authors of the slop that the corporations were lapping up and the readers that were consuming the slop. It seems a little bit one-sided to put all of the blame on corporations qua corporations just because they found a formula that worked, that people actually wanted to read, and by God, people read books. We don't even have that these days. Another one of her conclusions is that Lord of the Rings is still kind of the best in its field. I wonder if she might not be kind of failing to see the forest for the trees or something like that. There are definitely a lot of really good not just subjectively, but objectively good fantasy epics that have appeared since Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings has a venerable position as, one of the super greats and one of the, very defining pieces in that particular genre, right? But, for instance, Raymond Feist. I've done reviews of a couple of his books. I'll do reviews of more when I get a chance. The way he handles politics, for instance, is a really interesting mix of, realism and idealism. And it's not the same as Lord of the Rings, even though it kind of shares some common elements. By too narrowly defining what qualifies as epic fantasy, we risk locking ourselves into believing that only something of the form of Lord of the Rings can be epic fantasy. Another point that she concludes with is that entertaining as an idea is subjective, which is true. Each person will decide different things that are entertaining. But the point to remember is that entertaining is not exactly what Del Rey was looking for. Del Rey was looking for entertaining to a large group of people who will also pay money to read these things. That is very much not a subjective thing. Now, after reading this, I went down to look at the comments because I was, kind of ambivalent about the essay itself, and there was a lot of controversy in some of the top comments. I'll just kind of bring out some of these ideas that we saw. For instance, one commenter noted that there were a lot of books that were outside of her very narrow history that don't fit the mold, the model that she was explaining. Ursula Le Guin was mentioned. Michael Moorcock before the 1990s was mentioned. On a similar note, there is a ton of fantasy before Lord of the Rings. R.E. Howard. Robert E. Howard died in 1936. Lord of the Rings was published in 1954 to 1955. Tanith Lee. Another thing that I found in the comments to this video, if you are looking for a bunch of fantasy authors that maybe you've never heard of, if you're like me and you dabble in fantasy but you don't really cover a lot of it in depth, there were a ton of cool names to look up in the comments to this particular video. One of them was Tanith Lee. I found a lot of cool names that I'm going to try to read some of their stuff. Another point that was made in the comments is that some great series were built up as effectively parodies of the Lord of the Rings formula. Not a negation so much as a poking fun at it. And of course, one of my favorite authors pops up in mention here, Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett turned, what was basically a fantasy parody into one of the most, fun and endearing and hilarious series of books that exists to this day. He's a damn legend. The comments noted her kind of apparent anti-corporate, anti-capitalist kind of bend. It was present in the video, but it was restrained. She wasn't, wearing a red sweater and waving her fist around. It's worth noting that in the comments that slop has always existed and always will, and this is of course true. 95% of everything is crap, right? We remember the really good episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation, but we don't remember the really bad ones. We remember the really good stories that we've read, but we don't remember the stories that we didn't finish. I was going to say do not finished, DNF'd, right? But anyway, I screwed it up. Also brought up was things like non-Tolkien fantasy. Lovecraft was kind of an iffy example, right? Because Lovecraft is kind of contemporary in a sense, where like the things that are happening in the real contemporary world. And that's something a little bit different from a lot of fantasy. But then there are stories like The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, where Lovecraft creates a beautiful and detailed fantasy world for his character to kind of explore through. But setting Lovecraft aside for the moment, we had people mentioning Robert E. Howard, Ashton Smith, Paul, P-O-U-L, Paul Anderson, Jack Vance, what's her name? The Second Story replied to this particular thing saying, oh, these are horror, not fantasy. And the very reasonable reply back that she got was, no, they're mostly not. Howard, Smith, Anderson, and Vance are not. Even Lovecraft wrote things that were pretty strict fantasy. I mean, we have to watch out as readers. We have to watch out for the possibility that what we do is we pigeonhole fantasy so that it must be something like Lord of the Rings, or it must be a negation of something like Lord of the Rings. If you one of the downsides to like chopping everything up in these tiny little niches is that someone says, well, I like, blah, 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 blah. And the person says, well, I like blah, 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 blah. And, on the grand scale, both of these things are fantasy, but, they're very different in their execution. It's also worth noting that one of the advantages to having all of these little niches is that they can be used to market things to people who like specific things, right? That's another thing that publishers need to do, is they need to say, oh, you liked book X? Well, you'll like book Y. Oh, you liked book A? Well, you'll like book Z, but you might not like book Y. That's something that people that sell books try to do. After looking through all of this, I kind of came to a series of conclusions. I mean, I think that this video is rightly controversial. Whenever you make a history of something and you oversimplify that much, you're going to get pushback from people who believe that other parts of the story were important enough that they should have been included. When you cut away all the extra bits so that everything kind of fits into your predetermined package, I think people can rightly be a little bit angry that you've done all this cutting to fit your particular chosen mold. After careful consideration, I agree with a lot of the commenters that this was way too clipped to history, and it completely ignores and neglects the pulps, which, while not necessarily, on Tolkien's level in a lot of ways, were very instrumental in the building up of this as a genre. And I think that ignoring them and pretending that fantasy started, in 1954 is a major mistake. Again, I mentioned this earlier, but there is kind of this forest versus trees problem, right? If we call fantasy, if the only thing we call fantasy are things that bring to mind Lord of the Rings, then yeah, it might be that Lord of the Rings is the best thing in that group, because everybody else on some level or another is kind of imitating when they end up in the same barrel. But if we broaden our horizons, if we look at more things and recognize them, that they have significant fantasy elements, we can probably find some evidence of very good works, on par with Lord of the Rings, that could also, roughly speaking, be classified as fantasy. Right? Just because you can broadly classify something doesn't mean that it's all the same. This is another pet peeve of mine, where people say, oh, well, all the story type X has been done. Well, I can, there only needs to be one book, is the reductio ad absurdum there, right? Well, once we've read one story, we've read all the stories, because everything's a story. And so we just need story, and once we read story, we're done. Obviously nobody takes it to this particular degree, but if you just say, well, we want, pastoral epic fantasy. Well, certain things are going to be part of the definition of pastoral epic fantasy that separate them from other things. And to complain that other things contain the elements of pastoral epic fantasy is to kind of complain that we made the definition in the first place. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's like complaining that my sci-fi has technology in it. Well, it's sci-fi, it has technology in it. If you make too many of these distinctions, you can end up typecasting a story in a way that you end up saying, well, this has to happen because, I'm kind of in this particular niche right now, and I don't want to rock the boat too much, right? Another element that I think is important is that writers need to serve the audience. They need to find an audience, right? It's extremely hard to get people to actually look at books. But setting that aside, authors need to do what works for other people to read their books if they want to have other people read their books. Authors can and should expect to improve over time. My voice as an author has certainly changed and improved over the last 2.5 years of writing rather intensively. If you go and look at some of my very old short stories, right when I just kind of started, you'll see that my style is very much improved since then. You'd have to actually look at some of my new stuff too, but setting that aside, there's always a pull, as a writer, there's always a pull between writing what you want and writing what is popular, right? Because writing what is popular is way easier to pay the bills. Writing what you want, well, you might not be able to pay the bills, or you could do something that people say, oh, there's something to this. And they also then what you want to do becomes what is popular. You can get lucky that way. And of course, it's also worth noting that what is popular changes over time, regardless of what you do, right? Having an entrepreneurial spirit as a writer is important to actually making progress and maintaining relevancy over a long period of time and over a large number of books. As for me, my plan is to keep writing and improving, and I hope some of you will consider reading some of my stuff at some point. But even if you don't yet, I hope to one day convince you that something that I wrote is actually worth reading. As always, if you want to support the channel and you like what I'm doing, you know what to do. There will be links in the description, stuff like that, and I hope you have a good rest of your week. I will be reading this next, and I've got some other ideas for some videos that I'm working on as well. I'm actually thinking about doing a video about, if you've ever played the game Deus Ex, it is a very fun game, classic first-person shooter with RPG elements kind of game. And there's a character in that game that I want to talk about a little bit, and how, with the very small amount of text that could be, attributed to this character in the game, that they actually managed to create a very interesting character that I think is worth looking at. So that's kind of another project that I'm working on right now. I'm also thinking about doing something a little bit more in depth with some Rex Stout stuff as well. Anyway, if any of that sounds interesting, feel free to check on by. As always, thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and I will see you next time. Have a good week, and probably have a good weekend.